All right, well, welcome to the final lecture in Photo 62A. Um, it's a. I'm going to talk about history today, or during this section, and just understand that there are whole 16, 18-week courses that are devoted to photographic history. So, by no means is this meant to be a comprehensive examination of the history of photography, but maybe give you some background as to its formation, where it started, where it's going, who are some big influencers, and pretty much any of the names that you find in these PowerPoints. They're probably one or two clicks away on any good search engine, and you could probably find everything you need to know about these individuals. And there's plenty of resources out there that talk about photo history. We actually have a photo history class here at West Valley. Kathy Arnold teaches it mostly online, I think. But every student that I've had that have taken that class has really enjoyed it. So if history is your thing and you want to learn a little bit more about this after today, then go look up the photo history class in the art history department, or just do some clicks on the internet because there's lots of information out there. So the basic idea of image formation has been around for a long time. Aristotle described it. Da Vinci used it. He used something called the camera obscura to project an image on the wall, in which he then drew from that image that was projected. And as we sort of go through time, this idea of a camera obscura or a pinhole camera becomes refined a little bit, to the point instead of just putting a small hole in a box, a light tight box, which basically is a camera obscura, a light tight box, to putting a lens in there, which is not that different than the cameras that we have today, and especially the camera I showed you in the very first week of class, where it had the front standard and the rear standard, lens and film, and in between was that accordion. It's just a dark, light tight box with a way to control the light coming through a lens, hitting the film for a prescribed amount of time and a prescribed intensity. So how many of you ever made a pinhole camera? I'm sure that in your high school photography class, maybe a science class, maybe a summer school projects class, you made a camera obscura or a pinhole camera. This is just an old photo of a camera with a lens, light tight box. The image is projecting on a piece of ground glass, and then you look through this little hooded area right here, and you can see the image. So basically, that's all it is. I did an experiment one time with my Canon DSLR, and that I took the lens off the camera. I got the body cap that protects the inside of the camera from dust when you don't have a lens on there, and I drilled a very teeny hole in the center. Then from the back, I put aluminum foil, and I literally put a pinprick in that aluminum foil, put that body cap back on my camera. I went out and took photographs, and you know what? I got pictures. They weren't great, but I got pictures. Here's another photographer that I've been following for quite some time, Alvaro Morel. He uses pinhole photography in a really interesting sort of way. He takes this idea of an apartment that's got a great view of something, the cityscape, the water, the harbor, something. And then he covers up all the windows, and in one of the windows he has a small pinhole, which then projects what is outside that window onto the wall behind. And then in that room, right, that has the projected image in it, then he props that room and things like that. So he's basically taking a picture of what's being projected by the pinhole camera onto the walls of these apartments. This is earlier work that he's done. He's done some other stuff subsequently that's been a little bit more interesting, using lenses and flipping the image so it's not upside down and backwards and stuff like that. But here's some really nice contrasty kind of images made with a pinhole camera, and then projecting on a wall in an apartment somewhere. This is a little bit later part of his work. So if you look at the drawing in the upper left, here you have the camera obscura, the light tight box. Here you have a lens on the very top, and depending on what this lens is pointing at, it takes that light, gathers that light, and projects it onto the floor of this camera obscura. Okay, and then he takes a picture of the image projected on the floor. So here's the real live version of that. Little lens up here on top. You can walk in and seal it. Black inside, very hot, I'm sure. White on the outside to bounce off as much light as possible. Seal it up so it's light tight. Then position this lens here so it's got a view of something, and it projects it. Here's on the bottom here. Here's the projected image of the landscape onto the dirt floor of the camera obscura. So here you're doing a really interesting mixture of, the landscape, and then the texture of the landscape being, sort of incorporated into the image. Okay, so on with the development about photography. So we have these cameras, right? These pinhole cameras that can project images, but none of them are permanent, right? Going back to Da Vinci, and that none of these were permanent. You can see them, you can project them, but you couldn't capture them. So on comes a guy, Niepce, and he experiments with silver nitrate on paper in a camera obscura. And it just so happens nitrate is the component we still use today in film, traditional film photography, both paper and the recording film. So this is quite a discovery back in the early 1800s. He abandoned the silver nitrate because he couldn't figure out how to fix it. He tried some other kind of ways of making the image real. These were kind of a little bit more gentle. I don't know what bitumen of Judah is, or some of these other oil of lavender. That would be a nice gentle chemical to use. And he was able to get some sort of permanent image from these different kind of materials that he was experimenting with. He invented the term holography. Helos sun, graphos draw, so drawing with light, drawing with the sun. And so he was able to make pictures from a camera obscura onto a piece of paper, make it permanent, and there you have it. Now, this is probably a copy of 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 blah, 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 of the very first photograph ever made. So it was out his apartment window, skyline, Paris, and captured this image in a permanent sort of way. It is sort of interesting under a little bit of inspection that you have this edge of the building lit by the sun and also this edge, which is a bit of a contradiction because they look like they're both facing the camera. But if you think about an 8-hour exposure, that's pretty much, having the camera open from 9 a.m. till 6 p.m. And letting the exposure burn that entire time. So the sun obviously moves and changes the direction of light. So that's how you can get an explanation of that happening. So while Niepce was playing around with different materials on paper, Daguerre started getting polished silver plates, polished silver plated on copper. Now, this was back to the silver, right? Niepce was kind of playing with some other chemicals. He had some success with silver nitrate, but he didn't know how to make it permanent. Well, Daguerre uses the same silver kind of plating onto a copper sheet, not paper, a copper sheet. And it was exposure was about 6 to 10 minutes, which was much faster than Niepce. It was developed in fumes of heated mercury. Now, mercury is one of those chemicals that we're not supposed to be playing with and having in our hands and stuff like that. But that was the way the daguerreotype was developed, and then a salt-based chemical was the fixer. Now, these were interesting images because they were one of a kind and laterally reversed. They were certainly upside down, but that's easy when you take it out of the camera to spin it 180 degrees. But they were laterally reversed because it really was the original from the camera. So you just got one. Okay, and 6 to 10 minutes isn't horrible, right? So in amongst all this development going on, Daguerre and Niepce get together and they form a little company, a little friendship, partnership, whatever you want to call it, to sort of develop this permanent way of capturing the image from the camera obscura. So it ended up, the daguerreotype won out over the Niepce's original design because it was sharper. The silver polished on copper was interesting because where the silver stayed, where exposure was made, right, where there was lots of light, it was very shiny. And where there was no light, the silver was removed and the copper sheet was exposed and it was very dark. So here we had our lights and darks in the image. So Niepce dies about 1833. Daguerre brings this idea to fruition, becomes famous. Again, they were laterally reversed, one-of-a-kind images. Studios opened all over Europe and U.S. People were excited about having a image of themselves, a permanent image of them, their family, something to pass on to their family, to hang in your house, to remember somebody by. Exposure's got a little bit better, 1 to 2 minutes. And, you know, the viewing thing was kind of weird because it had to be angled a certain way to get the shine off the silver, to make the highlights pop. And then, of course, the mercury fumes for fixing was not, or for developing was not necessarily the greatest solution in terms of the lab technicians breathing these fumes of mercury all day long. So then on comes William Henry Fox Talbot. What a great name, huh? 4 names altogether. So he invented this first negative-positive system. He kind of, around the same time as Daguerre, he had this idea that if you go to what Niepce was doing and you sensitize a piece of paper and then you put it in the camera and you make an exposure with a camera obscura, then you fix that piece of paper, like that image we saw before. Then you take that image and you lay it on top of another sensitized piece of paper. And now you have a positive, laterally correct, permanent image. So now what you basically have created is a paper negative. Because it wasn't as clear and as sharp as film is today. You had to go through the fibers of the paper base. So it wasn't very sharp. It lost a lot of contrast. But it was a way to make multiple copies of the same image, which then got really exciting. Because then you didn't have to go and pay your, whatever you paid for each original image. You can get one negative and make 4 copies and give them to your family and friends. Tough because the daguerreotype was still sharper. It had more contrast. It was a better overall image, but it was one of a kind. Here's just a little old photograph taken of Talbot viewing his Talbot types, an old-time studio somewhere on a rooftop somewhere. So then experimentation started happening with this, sort of plate process. And so now what people were thinking, well, okay, we can take this paper negative, we can expose it in the camera obscura, we can then sandwich it together with another piece of paper and make a copy, and another copy, another copy, another copy. But again, it wasn't as sharp, it wasn't as contrasty as the daguerreotype. So somebody, I don't know who it was, had the brilliant idea of taking this silver nitride and coating it on a piece of glass. Putting it on the glass, painting it on the glass, putting the glass in the camera, taking a picture, and then sandwiching that to another piece of paper that's been sensitized, and make a duplicate. There you have a positive, and you have left, right, correct, and you can make as many as you want. Okay. The trick was on paper, the emulsion could dry, and when you got it wet to process it, it would then soften, right? And you can then allow the chemicals to go to work on the silver that had been exposed to light, and those that hadn't. Here, the glass doesn't get soft; it's hard. right? So they had to figure out a way to take this plate and coat it, right? And while it was still semi-wet, not completely dry, but not wet enough to run off the plate, they would then put that in the camera, take the picture, and develop it right away. Therefore, the wet collodion process. So it's like taking a piece of glass and then coating it with silver, getting it to the point where it's almost dry, shooting, processing, and then fixing, and then letting it dry, and then you have your permanent negative. So you had to bring your darkroom with you in the field. It was a little bit more work. But you could make multiple copies. And they were sharp. And they had contrast. Right? And they were using basically the same thing we use now. We use silver nitrate on the paper, on the film, and we use a salt-based fixer to fix it. So the chemicals have been the same. Refined, albeit, but it's basically the same. So basically replace the daguerreotype. Because of the daguerreotype being more expensive, single, more dangerous, and here comes the wet collodion process. They called it some other things, ambrotype, tintype. So you'll see tintypes and ambrotypes at flea markets and people selling them, and you might look at those and say, "Wow, that's a daguerreotype. I should take that. I should buy that." Well, most of them aren't. If it was a daguerreotype, it'd be worth a lot of money. Sorry, I need to wet my throat a little bit. Just a cartoon of the darkroom that was taken into the field while shooting was being done. So as we continued to move on, we in 1880 we developed the first dry plates. Okay, the emulsion is put in gelatin, and the gelatin hardens, but once it gets in water, it softens, and the chemical can go to work on the silver nitrate. The fixer can go to work on making it permanent, and then once it dries, right, it's hard, it's firm, and you can make your copies. Right? So that way you could take your plates, coat your plates at home, let them dry, put them in a light tight box, go out in the field and make your photographs. Box them back up, light tight box, go home and process the film or the glass plates. Later they figured out you can put this on roll film. You can put this on film and sheets of transparent materials, any kind. Could be glass, could be plastic, anything that was clear. You could coat this stuff with. So on comes George Eastman of Eastman Kodak. First dry plate and film company. Introduced the roll film with gelatin on an acetate base. They had a really nice little business model. You'd buy a camera for I think $25, and it would come preloaded with enough film in there to take 100 photographs. And when you were done, you'd send the camera back to Kodak. They'd process the film. They'd make prints of each of the 100 exposures, send them back to you, and then, of course, if you paid another $25, send you another camera. So, really, until Kodak folded or sort of got out of the film business, they've still been doing this, disposable camera idea. This is nothing brand new. They've been doing it for their entire sort of existence as a company. They went on to develop color slide film and color negative film and motion picture film, and Kodak became the standard. It has been and still is probably considered in a lot of ways the standard of the film industry in terms of innovation and quality of films and how long they've been able to be around and do this sort of thing. So the cameras basically look like this. Small little Kodak Brownie kind of camera with an insert that had the film. Sorry about that. The insert that had the film, and also the little hole on there was a circular image that was created. Those are the images that came back from Kodak. We probably had one exposure, one f-stop for bright sun. Go out in the sun, take pictures. Don't do it at night. Do it in the sun, and they're able to make some pretty good likenesses of what you saw. So this took photography and put it in the hands of the masses. Of course, the masses that had $25. And in that time, $25, I don't know what it's equivalent to today. It was a lot. Take pictures. It wasn't something everybody had sitting around their house, or 5 or 6 of them sitting around their house. It was quite expensive. Okay? So, anyways, it wasn't open to everybody, but at least it was